Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of r/ProRevenge. In today's episode, mock my mother's death? I bankrupt you. Excuse me, Satan. I think you're in my seat. Before we get started, make sure to subscribe so you will never miss a video. So let's get started. Mock my mother's death? I bankrupt you. So this could be a very, very long story. I'll try to summarize where and when I can. My now ex-wife Kate and I moved to an apartment in 2010. The house as a whole was a renovated townhouse split between two sides with 2 apartments on the bottom and 2 apartments upstairs, addresses ending in 126 to 128 accordingly. I wasn't the biggest fan of the apartment as it was a much older building that I had ever lived in, but I quickly adjusted to the wood creaking throughout the night. On the initial walkthrough we noticed that the only problem was that there was a dip in the bathroom ceiling. The landlord, Jay, promised us that he would get it fixed ASAP. 1 year to the day that we moved in, there was a loud crash at 4 a.m. The bathroom ceiling had collapsed and there was tiling and wood all over the floor and in the bathtub. Now Kate was typically the aggressive one, while I was more passive and laid back, and she kept calling Jay throughout the day. When she got in touch with him at around 9 p.m. she explained what happened and insisted that it be fixed immediately. Jay rebuffed, yelling that his girlfriend was a lawyer and he didn't need to do anything. Now this is where I got mad. I went outside to have a cigarette and to call him myself. I feigned a relaxed demeanor, and at first he began trying to talk to me as a bro and kept saying, "Dude, I'm gonna get someone out there, but it's gonna take a few weeks." When he couldn't sway me that way, he began yelling about his girlfriend and her knowing the law. What he was unaware of was that I had read the tenant laws in my state, and so, as he tried to lie, I waited until he was finished, and I then recited the law stating that, if an apartment was considered uninhabitable, then the landlord needed to pay for the tenant to stay in a place until it was resolved, meaning he would have to pay for us to stay in a hotel of our choosing every night until the ceiling was fixed. He tried to say that our upstairs neighbor Phil was the super, but he wasn't sure if he could get him down there that night. He placed me on hold, then came back a few minutes later and said that Phil and his girlfriend were out of state. I rang Phil's doorbell and asked, with the J on speakerphone, if he was assigned as the super. He laughed and said no. Dejected, Jay said he would have people out there the next day. Previously he said they were busy for at least 3 weeks. There's more to this incident, but it led to 2 conclusions. If you're going to lie, then there has to be a consistency in your lie, and make sure that the people you lie to don't communicate with each other. This is where a feud started between me and my Kate versus him and his mother. She was the original landlord and gave the house to him so he could begin to make a side profit. Fast forward to a year later. Jay stopped coming to the house and his mom began doing the pickups. Around this time my ex and I had been laid off and we were working with Social Security for food, health, and housing insurance. We were approved for all 3 in April, but we would not get the check until May. When our typical check wasn't in the landlord's mailbox, he immediately gave a summons saying that he was taking us to court for eviction. The day we went to court he had no lawyer and, going before the judge, here's the summation, or rather a non-verbatim account, of how the case went. Judge, does the defense have a means to pay within 90 days of non-payment? Us, yes, Your Honor. Hands over paperwork showing that he will be reimbursed for April and May. Judge, I see no problem. They are breaking no laws. Why are we here? Jay, well, Your Honor, they have been bullying. Judge, I don't care, unless they are breaking a law then this case is dismissed. Suffice it to say Jay and his mothers were not happy. Around this time in my life things were tumultuous. My mother, who had been battling lung cancer for 4.5 years, succumbed to it in June. This happened at roughly the same time his mom came knocking, looking for payment. I explained that I would leave the check in the mailbox when we got back from the funeral home, and to please just respect my right to mourn. She took her fingers and began rubbing them together, pretending to play the world's smallest violin. I will never forget what she said next. "Oh, my mommy just died. Woe is me. She probably had it coming. I don't care if your entire family is dead. I want my money." She smiled smugly, proud with what she had just said. I saw red and my heart jumped into my throat. I went, grabbed the check, and handed it to her in absolute shock that anyone would say something so fucked up. She had finally managed to push a button that very few people I've known throughout my life have gotten close to pressing. I went into rage mode, but not in the way you would expect. The revenge. We were always told that if a health inspector came by to not open the door. I waited until August since that was the month before the lease was going to run out and we knew they would not extend a renewal. I walked up the block to town hall to ask for a health inspection of our property. It was scheduled for several days later. Now it's important to know several things. I was friends with all of the tenants. Phil had moved out with his fiancée, but the new tenant was a really cool girl around my age named Danny. Tom and Hannah on the other side of the downstairs floor had moved out in July and Jay was still looking to fill it. The only one who wanted to stay out of this was Rose on the upper right apartment. I had gotten permission and her spare key so I could let the inspector in Danny's apartment, and I knew that I could use the back staircase on the right side to let him in on Tom's, now vacant apartment. I also knew that Danny was moving out in September, a month after Kate and myself. The inspector came, and it was glorious. He checked the exterior of the house first, noting that wires were exposed. There was an old empty dryer along with other odd clutter in the backyard. I bought him inside the shared entrance and, as I was counting on, he noticed that the last inspected dated back to 1994, 18 years. This meant that for each year he did not have an inspection there would be appropriate fines. For our apartment we had black mold growing in our bathroom and the bubble in the ceiling had begun to regrow to problematic proportions. Upstairs, Danny's apartment was suffering from leaks in the ceiling, and it looked like her bathroom ceiling was also on the brink of collapsing. We then went to the basement. The boiler was on the verge of exploding. There was flammable items along with gasoline and a pack of matches sitting right beside it. Two things that I did not know was: 1. The fire door that separated the two sides did not close all of the way, rendering it moot. To be honest, I had never heard of a fire door until that day. 2. On the right, 128 portion, basement side there was a toilet. A toilet that had blown up. It had coated the surrounding walls and the leakage prevented us going up to the floor via the right side. The entire time the inspector was photographing and writing constantly. We stepped outside and he said he needed to come back. When I asked why, he said he had run out of space to write down all of the infractions. He had filled the front and had written an entire page on the back portion. I kindly and coyly asked, well, how much will it cost right now? He scratched his head and said around 20-30K from what I can see, but it's probably going to be higher as this house was never licensed to be split into apartments. I thanked him, and he was going to come back with the county inspector. We were gone when that took place, though I did ask him to send me a copy with the list of violations to my new address. So we moved out at the end of August, but I got the updates from Rose. Because he was the current owner, he owed all current fines, and no one could not move into the empty apartments until everything was up to code. Because 3 out of 4 were vacant, he was losing $4,500 in potential rent. He handed the property back to his mother and had to file for bankruptcy. Now, here's the other thing. Every time an old tenant left and a new one was coming in, an inspection was supposed to be done. Now that all of the financial burden fell on her, they looked into the records, and she was fined for each time she had broken that rule 750/per. By the end of the year, Rose had moved out, so the place was hemorrhaging money. I sat back, proud of what I had done, and left it be. Haha, no, fuck that. I wasn't close to done yet. I felt like I had destroyed Jay, but my real target had always been his mom. I learned that she had 8 properties throughout 3 towns in my county. I went to each one, spoke to the tenants, and said I was a concerned tenant from another property and asked if they had any problems with their apartments. Every person I asked described the apartment in very poor to intolerable levels, and that the mom was effectively a slumlord. She would ignore problems unless someone turned to litigations. She was threatened that they would summon the inspector, or, more often than not, the people would move out. She'd refuse their deposit and sink those into cosmetic repairs, so that the apartment looked nicely furnished. People rarely fought back, because she knew that the occupants were of upper-lower class minorities. So, being the concerned person I was, I went to the inspector of the other 2 towns and asked for an inspection to be done with at least one tenant, if not more, would be awaiting the inspector when they came. Turns out that she faced pretty much the same infractions on every apartment she owned. It turned out she actually had 12 apartments, but I initially only knew about the ones that fell within my county. The remaining properties in the next county over were given a mysterious heads-up to perform a surprise inspection. From what I can tell, Jay's mom had been in the landlord business for about 35 to 40 years. That collapsed quickly. Since we moved literally 1 block down the road from our old one, 54, I got to see Jay lose his primary source of income and have to claim bankruptcy, but also saw that his mother was also trying desperately to find a buyer for all of the apartments so she could pay off the fines. I learned 2 years later, 2014, that she too had to file for bankruptcy. Jay and his mother camped out in front of our next apartment 2 days in October of 2013 before she filed for bankruptcy. I'm guessing to scream at me and or Kate, so I called the cops and said that there were strange people standing in a no parking zone, and they kept looking up at the second floor. A cruiser swung by and told them to leave. I know I should have used the 2 months I spent monitoring everything to find a new job, but this was the one and only time I wanted to cripple a person where they hurt the most, their wallets. I think I got my point across. None of this would have happened if you had just fucking fixed the ceiling before it collapsed. Jay. Dr. had a couple of slumlords. They pushed me to a place where I snapped, and so I went a bit crazy and bankrupted the slumlord and his slumlord mother as well. Excuse me, Satan. I think you're in my seat. I'm going to start this story off by saying that this is absolutely not one of my most shining moral moments, and that I'm well aware that I was a straight-up asshole for doing what I did. My only real defense is that I was in a super bad place mentally and needed a mountain's worth of therapy. If you're curious about the circumstances around her, check my profile. Bitch was evil in human form. Now, on with the revenge. I was a weird kid growing up, really weird. It was mostly because I was being abused at home and forcibly isolated. My social skills were so underdeveloped that I had difficulty reading human faces aside from my grandmother, grandfather and father. Being the weird kid meant I was a juicy target for bullies. It never stopped, but there was one bully that I hated more than any of the others. We'll call her Holly. This girl never passed up an opportunity to make my life hell, and since she lived across the street from me there was nowhere I could avoid her. Holly treated me like garbage. Here are a few examples. She put dog crap in our mailbox on a regular basis. She let my dog out of my yard, and I was never able to get her back. She would also sit on her porch with her friends and roast the hell out of me to entertain them if I so much as put a toe outside of my front door. It went on for years. I hated her with the fiery passion of 1,000 suns, but while my grandmother was still alive there was nothing I could do about Holly. If I did anything to her or fought back in any way my grandmother would punish me for it, and I was more afraid of her than I was Holly for a very good reason. So I made a plan. I suffered through all the abuse and promised myself that when I was older, I would make Holly pay for what she did to me. Thinking of what I was going to do to her when the time was right was sometimes the only thing that kept me going. Over time, Holly grew up, and eventually she left me alone and stopped being an asshole. Unfortunately for her by then it was too late. I didn't give a shit about her new moral epiphany. I had been nursing my grudge for 2 decades, and it was time for a reckoning. I was going to destroy that bitch. When my grandmother finally died, it was go time, and I'd had 20 years to plan. It wasn't idle while I waited. I'd made it my mission in life to learn as much about Holly as possible, and to do it I became friends with a few people on the periphery of her social circle. Eventually, I knew more about her and her life than her own mother did. The first step I took in my plan was getting her fired from her job. It took longer than I would have liked, but eventually I managed it. Holly worked at a doctor's office, and I knew that the doctor she worked for was super Christian. Very straight edge, upstanding type of guy. He also had a huge influence on the local community. I decided to become a patient at his office, scheduling my visits to be on the days Holly was off work. After a couple of visits I just happened to notice Holly in the staff photo on the waiting room wall. I made a show of looking surprised and then concerned. I got to the exam room, and the doctor came in shortly after. The expression on my face got his attention, and he asked me what was wrong. I told him that even though I didn't want to, as a Christian I couldn't keep my knowledge a secret and still sleep at night because I just couldn't let him endanger his soul and reputation by doing nothing. I had his full attention, then, and I asked him as one fellow Christian to another not to tell anyone where he got the information I was about to give him. After he promised he would, I told him that I knew that Holly was using illegal drugs. He was absolutely floored, and at first he didn't believe me. I told him that I understood his skepticism entirely, but it was easy enough to prove or disprove my information with a drug test. If I was wrong, he lost nothing. If I was right, he was saving himself from trouble down the road. He finally agreed to test her, and he tested everyone else too, so that it didn't look like Holly was the only target. See, I wasn't actually lying. Holly smoked a shitload of weed, and I knew that because it was my dad she used to get it from. He'd been her weed dude since she was like 15. Her test came back positive for marijuana and, much to my surprise, Xanax. Oopsie. The doctor fired Holly on the spot when the results of the urinalysis came back, and then he called me to thank me for telling him what was going on, and before he hung up he told me that I truly walked with the Lord. Y'all will never know how hard I had to fight not to laugh at the depths of his wrongness. I thought I was going to pop a blood vessel. Phase 1, complete. I know what you're thinking, it's just a job and it's not like she can't go get another one, right? Losing a job isn't the end of the world. You'd be wrong. Remember how I said that her boss had a very high reputation in our area? That man called every single hospital and doctor's office in the state personally to make sure that none of them would hire Holly and risk liability and loss of community trust for associating with her. Holly's field of study was all pertaining to the medical profession, so her education was rendered worthless because nobody would hire her. I wasn't done yet. Nope. Not even close. She lost her job, and because she had no income her car got repossessed. She still had her family though, 2 kids and a fiancé. Who needs families? Am I right? With the help of a good friend of mine, we catfished the fuck out of her fiancé. My friend is hot AF, and she let me use pictures of her to prove that she was really real. She even got on Skype with him once. When he finally made the arrangements for a face-to-face encounter and booked a hotel room, I texted the screenshots of everything to Holly from a burner number. To say the excrement impacted the oscillating unit would be a vast understatement. They broke up, the whole thing was an ordeal and Holly was devastated. She had 2 kids, no job, and now no fiancé who could help her keep the family afloat. A normal person would have stopped then. Unfortunately, I am not normal, and I was going full scorched earth. I see that for 20 years, no way in hell was I going easy on her. Phase 3. With her fiancé gone and no job, Holly was struggling badly. She needed money, and she needed it quickly before she and the kids got evicted. Meth is a giant problem in my area. It's high risk, but it's also fast money, and so I started subtly mentioning Holly's situation among my more legally questionable family. Eventually one of my family's friends who happened to be a meth cook got in contact with Holly and offered her a shitload of cash to let him cook dope at her house. It was supposed to be a one-time thing. 2 days and then done forever. Holly was desperate, so she said yes. Everything went smoothly at first, but dead in the middle of the cook someone called in an anonymous tip about an active cook in progress to the local narcotics unit. They rolled up on Holly's house at about 3 a.m. and caught everybody inside, including Holly red-handed making meth. Watching her cry when they handcuffed her and put her in that police cruiser was one of the most gloriously satisfying moments of my life. She was in deep legal dada, and to make a bad situation even worse, most houses where labs are discovered aren't deemed habitable afterwards because the toxic fumes from the chemicals used to make the drug get everywhere, and it's super hard and time-consuming to clean. It's up to the property owner to either hire a hazmat team to clean it, or condemn it and tear it down. A lab cleanup costs thousands of dollars. It would have cost more money to clean it than the entire property was worth. So it got torn down, with everything Holly owned still inside. See, you can't take things out of a meth lab, because they're going to be covered in toxic residue. It can make you very sick, especially young children. Everything in the residence is usually counted as a loss. Now, some people sneak in and grab stuff anyway, but whatever, it's their funeral. But since Holly was still sitting in jail, there was no way for her to get anything, and none of her close family were interested in risking getting caught sneaking into the house and being accused of stealing or tampering with a crime scene. Holly ended up in jail for a while, and while she was gone the court gave their father, ex-fiancé, sole custody of their children, and Holly was only given supervised visitation. 2 hours every Saturday if I recall correctly. Revenge is a dish best served cold, and mine was freezing. I was behind every single bad thing that happened in Holly's life, in one way or another for an entire 5-year period. She decided she liked bullying me and making my life hell, and she figures there would never be any consequences. Instead, I took her reputation, her job, her fiancé, got her arrested and convicted of a felony, and her children taken from her, and the best part is that she has no clue I did it to this very day. She'd forgotten about me, what she did to me impacted my life forever, but to her it wasn't even important enough to her to bother remembering. I was nothing to her, so she never connected me to her problems. Last I heard, she was in rehab for alcoholism and had her parental rights terminated permanently. After she lost her kid, she just sort of gave up and crawled into a bottle and never came out again. I was tempted to tell her, but I decided that the helplessness and confusion about why everything suddenly went to hell in a handbasket was the better plan, because that means that every now and again I can contact her and pretend to give a shit about her troubles to get a fresh revenge boner about her newest tale of woe. She thinks I'm the nicest person she's ever met. X post from r/ProRevenge. Someone said this post would fit in here. If you made it to the end of the video, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe and share, and we will see you in the next video.